Good morning, everyone. I hope you are all doing well. I am doing pretty good myself. So today's video is going to be another video on the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. This time, it is the evolution of Beren and Luthien. Now, this happens to be one of my favorite stories of his. This was first published in the Silmarillion. They do reference these characters in The Lord of the Rings. Aragorn and Arwen are basically a rewriting, a retelling of that story. The tale of, Aragorn and Arwen and their love. And it's very, very similar story, and you see that with, Lord of the Rings being similar to The Hobbit and, all this other stuff. And there's obviously similarities there. But this, as it's titled, is about the evolution of the story. Just in brief, I'm not going to go into all the details because there's a lot. There's a lot of books to pour through. The main book there's two main books, really. Actually, more than two main books. You have the history of Middle Earth. A lot of this is in there. But then, of course, you have this book that came out not that long ago, right before Christopher died, Tolkien's son. So this is basically takes everything from Silmarillion, all the works that Tolkien wrote on that, and compiles them into this book. So you get a cohesive story about how the story evolved, how the writing of it evolved. Very highly recommend this if you have read the Silmarillion. You don't have to read all those other books. But, obviously if you're a big fan, you're going to. Anyway. The germ of the story was in 1916, before Tolkien went off to war. Him and his wife were in a small wood, and, she was dancing for him. And that's where the idea for this came from. Of course, he went to war, the Battle of the Somme, however you pronounce that, World War I, over in France. But then he contracted trench fever and got sent home, and basically spent the rest of the war at home, sick. And while he was in the hospital, he would write the tales that would become, he would write what would become the Book of Lost Tales. Now, something that he did commonly back then is he would write something in pencil and then write over it in ink and erase the pencil. So for the tale of Beren and Luthien, originally titled Tale of Tinuviel, that's how that was done. Now, originally, Beren, as in the later story, was a mortal man who fell in love with an elf maiden, and they had to choose what races they wanted to belong to, and they could dwell together, which is what they did. They chose to be mortal and live together as husband and wife, and they died. But Tolkien, in the ink version of the tale, he changed him to an elf, or what he would call a gnome, because there was elves and gnomes. Gnomes are basically a type of elf at this point in the story. Of course, he changed that later on. I mean, because you think of gnome, you think of the little garden ornaments in people's lawns with the beard and the little pointy hat. That's not what they were in Tolkien's world at this point in time. And, of course, he would later switch Beren back over to a human, as he would remain. Now, originally you had Tevildo, the Prince of Cats, was the main villain, and as I had explained in another video, that character would be replaced by Thu the Wizard, who would become Sauron, Lord of the Rings. Now, Thu originated in the Lay of Luthien, or the Jest of Beren and Luthien, as it's called, which is that story written in poetic form. Here you also have the elf kingdom of Nargothrond comes into existence. It did not exist before. and the story was much different, and I will probably do an even bigger video on this later. Trying to keep this short today, so this is just like a brief overview. This was written from 1925 to 1931. He abandoned it, was never finished. Of course, in 1925, to describe what's going on in the Lay of the Children of Hurin for a friend of his, he wrote a sketch of the mythology. From that, of course, would come the Silmarillion. He, of course, sent this over to C.S. Lewis while he was writing it. Lewis wrote this very, very interesting commentary on it. And if he had a suggestion that Tolkien was like, you know what, that's a good idea, I'll change it to that, he would change it. Otherwise, he'd ignore it, because that's just how he was. This is, of course, like I said, this is where Through the Wizard enters, replacing Tevildo. 1930, you have the Quinta Noldorinwa. And then in 1936, the Quinta Silmarillion. From this, of course, would come the Silmarillion as published. Of course, he abandoned this stuff for a while to go work on Lord of the Rings, which he started in 1937, finished it in 1949, but then he had to revise it and get ready for publication, and there were some issues there. But after it was finished, he went back to revise the lay, but again, abandon it, go back to work on the Silmarillion. Yeah, that's pretty much it for that. And of course, like I said earlier, Aragorn and Arwen, kind of a retelling of the story because it's very similar, and of course they are descendants of Beren and Luthien, if you read the Lord of the Rings. What's really interesting is on the gravesite for Tolkien and his wife, on their tombstone, below their names are written Beren and Luthien. Because, again, that's goes back to when she was dancing for him in that small wood, and that's where the idea for it came. So it truly is a love story. I think it's the greatest one that Tolkien wrote. And as I said, it's my favorite out of all the tales from the Silmarillion. Although Children of Hurin is pretty good, Fall of Gondolin is pretty good. But this is by far, I think, my favorite out of all of them. And there you have it. So if you like this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy my content, and I will see you all later.